Somewhere on a small island in the Bay of Bengal, there are people whose blood carries a secret that modern science still cannot fully explain. In the last 2 years, researchers have found not one, but two brand new ancient human groups hidden inside living DNA, groups nobody had ever named before, and when scientists tried to fit every population on Earth onto one clean family tree, one small group of islanders broke the whole chart. Their genes did not match the pattern. Their ancestry pointed to human relatives that vanished tens of thousands of years ago, and to at least one group that science still cannot identify at all. This is the story of the Andaman Islanders, the ghost DNA hiding inside them, and the newest discoveries from 2025 and 2026 that are rewriting the human story all over again. Large genetic surveys over the past 2 decades have done something remarkable. Researchers have collected DNA samples from hundreds of populations spread across every inhabited continent, then fed that data into computers to reconstruct how every group of people on Earth relates to every other group. Almost everywhere, the results lined up neatly with what historians and archaeologists already expected. Populations that live near each other tend to share more recent ancestry. Populations separated by oceans or mountain ranges tend to have split apart much longer ago. Layered on top of each other, these relationships form something close to a branching family tree, with deep roots in Africa and newer branches spreading outward across every other continent. It is a tidy, elegant picture, and the Andaman Islanders are the clearest proof that the real picture is far messier than the tidy tree suggests. Then, roughly 60 to 70,000 years ago, a small band of humans left Africa for good. Nobody knows the exact number, but most estimates put it at only a few thousand people crossing into the Middle East, likely through the Sinai Peninsula or the narrow strip of water at the mouth of the Red Sea. When they arrived on the other side, they were not alone. Other human species were already living there. In Europe and to Western Asia, they met the Neanderthals, a stocky, muscular, cold-adapted people who had already been living across that region for several 100,000 years. The two groups shared territory for thousands of years. They competed, they clashed, and at times they had children together. That is why almost everyone alive today whose ancestors are not purely African carries a small amount of Neanderthal DNA, usually somewhere between 1% and 2%. Populations with deep African ancestry alone tend to carry very little or none, simply because their family lines never passed through the regions where that mixing took place. It is a small percentage, but it is not meaningless. Some of that inherited Neanderthal DNA sits inside genes tied to immune response, skin pigmentation, and how the body handles cold climates. A kind of borrowed toolkit that may have helped early modern humans survive in unfamiliar environments far from the tropical climate their ancestors evolved in. In a strange twist, other inherited Neanderthal segments have been linked to modern health risks, including how some people's immune systems respond to certain infections. In other words, encounters that took place tens of thousands of years ago are still quietly shaping the biology of people living today, whether they know it or not. But Neanderthals were only one of the human relatives still walking the Earth at that time. In 2010, researchers working in a remote cave in the Altai Mountains of Siberia sequenced DNA from a tiny finger bone and found something nobody expected. An entirely separate human lineage, distinct from both us and the Neanderthals. They named this new group the Denisovans, after the cave where the bone was found. Scientists have still never recovered a complete Denisovan skeleton. Everything known about them for over a decade came from a handful of teeth, a fragment of skull, and that single finger bone. Yet from those scraps, scientists pulled a full genetic code, and that code turned out to hold one of the biggest surprises in the history of human genetics. When researchers compared Denisovan DNA to the genomes of living people around the world, they expected the strongest match to appear near Siberia, close to where the bones were found. Instead, the highest concentration of Denisovan ancestry on the entire planet turned up thousands of miles to the south, in Papua New Guinea, Australia, and across the islands of Melanesia. People from these regions carry somewhere between 4 and 6% Denisovan DNA, more than 20 times higher than anywhere in mainland Asia. That single fact hinted that the Denisovans had lived across a much larger stretch of the world than anyone had assumed. But the true anomaly, the population that genetics still struggles to explain, was found on a chain of islands even further west. The Andaman Islands sit in the Bay of Bengal, roughly halfway between India and Myanmar. More than 500 small islands make up the chain, most of them thickly forested and uninhabited. For thousands of years, the people living there had almost no contact with the outside world. No trading ships regularly stopped. No neighboring empire conquered them. They lived as small bands of hunter-gatherers, hunting wild pigs with bows, and fishing the shallow coastal waters with hand-woven nets, largely cut off from the waves of migration, farming, and conquest that reshaped nearly every other population on Earth. While farming spread across the mainland, cities rose and fell, And empire after empire redrew the map of Asia. The islands sat mostly untouched, wrapped in dense forest and surrounded by water that made large-scale contact difficult. That isolation is exactly what made the islands such an unusual genetic time capsule. Populations that stay cut off for tens of thousands of years do not just keep their culture distinct. Their DNA keeps accumulating small, unique changes separately from everyone else, almost like a manuscript copied and recopied in one closed room, while every other copy in the world kept getting revised, translated, and mixed together with new material. When European sailors first made contact with the islands in the late 1700s, they were startled by what they found. The islanders were short in stature, often under 5 feet tall, with very dark skin and tightly curled hair. Sailors at the time assumed they must be of African origin, shipwrecked and stranded far from home. For roughly 2 centuries afterward, no one could say for certain where the Andamanese people actually came from. Some researchers guessed they were descendants of enslaved Africans. Others suspected they were survivors of an ancient migration wiped out everywhere else. Without genetic tools, both theories remained pure speculation. That changed once DNA sequencing technology matured in the early 2000s. When scientists finally extracted and analyzed genetic material from Andamanese communities, the results overturned every existing theory at once. The Andamanese were not of recent African descent. They were not closely related to the mainland Indian populations living just a few hundred miles away. In fact, they turned out to be one of the most genetically isolated peoples ever studied, having split off from the ancestors of nearly everyone else alive today somewhere between 50 and 70,000 years ago, placing them firmly within that very first wave of humans who ever left Africa. In most parts of the world, the descendants of that first wave were absorbed, pushed aside, or replaced by later arrivals, farming societies expanding out of the Fertile Crescent, herding populations sweeping in from Central Asia, and other large-scale migrations that overwrote earlier genetic signatures, layer by layer. The Andaman Islands were different. Isolated by water and unreached by later migrations, the descendants of that original wave survived there largely undisturbed for tens of thousands of years. In genetic terms, the Andamanese are a living window into what those first travelers out of Africa may have looked like, genetically speaking, before later mixing reshaped almost every other population on the planet. That discovery alone would have made global headlines, but researchers were not finished. When scientists studied the Andamanese genome more closely, they found segments of DNA that were neither modern human nor Neanderthal. They were Denisovan, the same archaic lineage first identified from that finger bone in a Siberian cave, thousands of kilometers to the north. And the amount was not trivial. The Andamanese carried significantly more Denisovan ancestry than mainland Asian populations, rivaling levels seen in parts of Melanesia. Under the existing model, this made no sense. Denisovans were believed to have lived primarily in Siberia and perhaps parts of East Asia, with their DNA later carried southward by migrating populations. But the Andamanese had been isolated on their islands for tens of thousands of years, with essentially no contact with the outside world. So how did Denisovan ancestry get there? The only explanation that fit the evidence was that Denisovans themselves must have lived much further south than researchers had ever suspected, likely across Southeast Asia, in regions that now include parts of modern Indonesia and the surrounding islands. When the first wave of modern humans passed through that region on their journey east, they appear to have encountered Denisovan populations there directly and interbred with them. Those mixed populations then split apart, with some ending up isolated on the Andaman Islands and others continuing east to become the ancestors of modern Melanesians and Aboriginal Australians. This single finding forced a major rewrite of the Denisovan story. Instead of a small, isolated population confined to cold Siberian mountains, Denisovans appear to have ranged across an enormous stretch of Asia, from freezing high-altitude terrain all the way down to tropical rainforest, adapting to wildly different environments for hundreds of thousands of years, while leaving behind almost no physical fossil trace beyond a jawbone recovered in Tibet in 2019 and the original Siberian fragments. In 2018, researchers digging deeper into Denisovan ancestry found something even stranger. The Denisovan DNA carried by people in Papua New Guinea and Australia did not come from one single source population. It came from at least 2 genetically distinct Denisovan groups, populations that had themselves split apart from one another at least 280,000 years earlier. Some scientists began referring to them separately, a northern lineage tied to the original Siberian cave population, and a southern lineage that appeared to have mixed heavily into the ancestors of the Andamanese, Papuans, and Aboriginal Australians. In other words, the human family tree was not really a tree at all. It looked more like a tangled network of different hominin populations, meeting, mixing, separating, and meeting again across hundreds of thousands of years, with the Andamanese sitting at one of the densest knots in that entire web. Even that was not the strangest part of the Andamanese genome. When researchers examined the very oldest layers of their DNA, fragments that did not match modern humans, Neanderthals, or either known Denisovan lineage. They found sequences that did not match anything in any existing genetic database. Not a known living population, not a known archaic human species, nothing on record at all. Scientists now refer to segments like this as ghost lineages, genetic fingerprints left behind by populations whose fossils have never been found, whose appearance is unknown, and whose very existence would be undetectable if not for the fact that fragments of their DNA are still present in living people today. The Andamanese carry exactly this kind of unexplained genetic material, evidence of at least one additional unidentified human population that contributed to their ancestry tens of thousands of years ago, and then disappeared from the fossil record entirely. This is not an isolated case. Some of the most important new evidence for these hidden populations has come out only in the past year. In 2025 and 2026, a team of geneticists at the University of California, Berkeley, published a new method for scanning the genomes of hundreds of living people to search for signs of ancient interbreeding that had never been detected before. Their technique found two previously unnamed archaic human lineages tucked inside modern DNA. One, which they call simply the ghost lineage, appears to have interbred with the ancestors of modern humans inside Africa more than 50,000 years ago, and traces of it now show up in every population studied on Earth, Africans and non-Africans alike, making up roughly 0.5% to a little over 1% of the modern human genome, a contribution comparable in size to Neanderthal ancestry outside Africa. The second lineage is even older and stranger, nicknamed the super-archaic ancestor. It appears to have split from the rest of the human family somewhere around 1.7 to 1.8 million years ago, making it vastly older than either the Neanderthal or Denisovan branches. This population did not mix directly with modern humans at all. Instead, it interbred with the ancestors of the Denisovans deep in their own history, and Denisovans then passed a small trace of that ancient genetic material onto us later, when they mixed with early modern humans in Asia. Researchers still do not know exactly which known fossil species, if any, this super-archaic lineage belonged to, though some have pointed to distant possibilities like early Homo erectus populations. What makes this finding especially remarkable is the method itself. Researchers did not need a single bone or tooth from the super-archaic population to detect it. They found it purely by comparing patterns hidden inside the DNA of living people, spotting unusually old genetic segments the same way a historian might notice a much older sentence style buried inside an otherwise modern paragraph. That approach opens the door to discovering still more vanished populations in the future, entirely without fossils, simply by reading the genetic record carried inside people alive today. At almost the same time, a separate breakthrough added even more detail to the picture. Researchers working with a skull, long nicknamed Dragon Man, originally recovered decades earlier in China, managed to extract enough preserved genetic material from hardened dental plaque to reconstruct a complete, high-coverage Denisovan genome. Only the second time in history a full Denisovan genome has ever been sequenced, and the very first time from an actual skull, rather than a tiny bone fragment. The genome is now giving scientists their clearest look yet at what Denisovans may have looked like and how their biology diverged from ours. Combined with earlier findings that a Denisovan inherited gene called MUC19 may have helped ancient human populations adapt as they migrated into new and difficult environments, the picture emerging from 2025 and 2026 research is unmistakable. Modern humans did not simply walk out of Africa into an empty world. They walked into a landscape already crowded with other kinds of humans, mixed with several of them repeatedly, and carried tiny fragments of all of them forward into the present day. Nowhere on Earth is that mixed inheritance more concentrated or more fragile than on the Andaman Islands. When the British colonized the islands in the 1850s, the indigenous population was estimated at somewhere between 5,000 and 8,000 people, spread across several distinct tribes, including the Great Andamanese, the Onge, and the Jarawa. Within only a few decades of sustained outside contact, diseases the islanders had no immunity to, measles, influenza, and others, devastated their numbers. The Great Andamanese population collapsed from thousands of people to a small fraction of that, and today only around 50 individuals remain. The Onge number close to 100. The Jarawa, who did not make peaceful contact with outsiders until 1998, number somewhere around 400. And the Sentinelese, a tribe living on their own small island who have violently rejected all outside contact for generations, are estimated at somewhere between 50 and 200 people, though no exact count exists, because anyone who tries to approach their shore is met with arrows. Each of these communities carries its own distinct history within that broader collapse. The Great Andamanese were once made up of at least 10 separate tribal groups, each with its own dialect, before disease and displacement forced the survivors into a single small settlement. The Onge were relocated multiple times by colonial and later national administrations, moves that disrupted traditional hunting and fishing territories built up over countless generations. The Jarawa, by contrast, avoided most direct contact until relatively recently, which is part of why their population, while still small, has fared somewhat better than their neighbors. Every one of these outcomes was shaped less by genetics and more by history, policy, and simple chance, a reminder that the fate of an irreplaceable genetic record can hinge on decisions made by governments and outsiders who may never fully grasp what is actually at stake. This means the specific combination of ancient DNA carried inside these communities, including genetic ghosts that cannot be traced to any known population, exists in only a few hundred living people on the entire planet. A single disease, outbreak, natural disaster, or policy failure could erase tens of thousands of years of unbroken genetic history in a single generation. The Indian government has recognized this risk and formally protects the islands, legally barring outsiders from making contact with the Sentinelese in particular. In 2018, an American visitor ignored those protections and attempted to reach Sentinel Island on his own. He was killed within hours of landing, and Indian authorities ultimately chose not to pursue the tribe, explaining that any retaliation would only increase the risk of disease exposure and further disruption to an already vulnerable community. Language reflects the same deep isolation seen in their DNA. The languages, once spoken across the Andaman Islands, are not clearly related to any language family found on the nearby mainland, and linguists still debate exactly how they connect to any other language on Earth. Several of these languages have already gone extinct, as their last fluent speakers died in the 20th century, taking with them not just vocabulary but oral history, traditional ecological knowledge, and ways of understanding the surrounding forest and sea that had been refined over thousands of years. In that sense, the loss facing these communities is not only genetic, it is cultural and linguistic as well, three different kinds of irreplaceable history converging on the same small handful of people. The Sentinelese remain almost entirely unstudied to this day. Satellite images occasionally show small forest clearings, thin trails of smoke, and tiny figures moving along the beach, evidence that the community continues to live, much as it likely has for thousands of years. After the massive Indian Ocean tsunami of 2004, a helicopter flew over the island simply to check whether anyone had survived. A Sentinelese man emerged from the tree line and fired arrows at the aircraft, proof, in its own strange way, that the community had endured. No aid was offered afterward, and no further contact was attempted. Indian authorities concluded that leaving the tribe completely alone was the safest option available, even in the aftermath of a disaster that killed roughly 250,000 people across the wider region. Taken together, these discoveries point toward a picture of human origins that looks nothing like the simple diagram most people grew up learning, a single branching tree with modern humans at the top. The real picture looks more like an interconnected web, shaped by repeated waves of migration, separation, and interbreeding among many different human populations across hundreds of thousands of years. Some of those populations left behind bones, others, like the newly identified African ghost lineage and the far older super-archaic group, left behind nothing except fragments of code buried inside the DNA of people alive right now. Researchers are actively searching other isolated populations for similar signals, including groups in the highlands of New Guinea, remote communities in the Amazon basin, and hunter-gatherer populations in Central Africa, and several of these searches have already turned up genetic echoes that do not match any known human lineage. For now, the Andaman Islanders remain one of the clearest windows humanity has into that lost, tangled history. Every strand of their DNA carries information about migrations, meetings, and vanished populations that predate written language, agriculture, and recorded history itself. Some researchers have even proposed that the full genomes of small, isolated populations like these should be carefully sequenced and preserved, with community consent, purely as a record of shared human heritage. Because if these populations disappear, an entire chapter of the human story disappears along with them, with no other copy anywhere on Earth. The great Andamanese and the Ong have already permitted limited genetic research under those terms. The Sentinelese, protected by both distance and their own resistance, remain the one population whose full genetic story may never be told at all. So the next time someone tells you the story of human evolution is simple and settled, remember the Andaman Islands. Remember a population that, according to the genetic map built from nearly 1,000 people across every inhabited continent, simply should not exist in the form it does. Carrying DNA from at least 2 distinct Denisovan populations, and from at least one more group science has never been able to name. Human history was not a straight line. It was a web of different peoples meeting in forests and coastlines that no longer show any trace of them, except for the small, living, breathing evidence still carried forward today. What makes 2025 and 2026 such a turning point is how quickly this picture is still changing. For over a decade after the original Denisovan discovery, scientists worked with little more than a handful of bone fragments and a single genome pieced together from a finger bone. Now, within the space of about 18 months, researchers have sequenced a second complete Denisovan genome from an actual skull, identified 2 entirely new ghost lineages using nothing but statistical patterns in modern DNA, and traced specific inherited genes to the practical advantages they may have given ancient populations, facing new climates and new diseases. Each of these findings on its own would have been considered a major discovery a few years ago. Together, they suggest that the outline of human origins is still far from finished, and that some of the biggest revisions may still be waiting to be found, not in a newly unearthed fossil, but in genetic material that already exists inside people who are alive on this planet right now.